Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome to the stage, from Screencraft, John Rhodes, and from the Writers Guild Foundation, Enid Portuguese.
们，请欢迎来自 Screencraft 公司的 John Rhodes 先生和来自作家工会基金会的 Enid Portuguese 先生。谢谢。
Thank you.
谢谢大家。
Very honored to be here.
我很荣幸的在
With
这
the
里跟大
Writers
家
Guild
见面。
Foundation presenting this panel on international storytelling, and very happy to be here at UCFTI. The genesis of this panel came from Emily and I discussing, how to host a conversation around writing between Hollywood and China. And it came out of the fact that Screencraft has now, for the second year in a row, a China-Hollywood Screenwriting Fellowship where we connect winners with a trip to China and mentorship with Chinese development executives and producers, and also here in LA with Hollywood mentors. And that's going to be launching in a couple of weeks, so check out screencraft.org for that. And without further ado, let's get into it. I'll hand it off to Enid.
Thank you, John. Thank you all for being here. The Writers Guild Foundation is thrilled to co-present this panel with Screencraft. We are a nonprofit organization whose mission is to preserve and promote the craft of writing for the screen. So we are always excited to be a part of conversations where writers talk about their process for telling their stories, as well as how the industry shares those stories with the world. Please do visit us if you're in Los Angeles at our library on 3rd and Fairfax. It's open to the public, not just members, as well as events that we throw throughout the year featuring film and TV writers. So let's get this conversation started. I'd like to introduce our moderator for today. She is the Director of Education and Outreach at Screencraft, Emily Dell.
Well, thank you so much to the Writers Guild Foundation and Enid. Thank you so much to Screencraft. And thank you to our hosts here. I am very, very excited to be part of a conversation about creativity with some of the finest minds in creativity today. And so I'd like to just dive in. I'll start with a little bit of background on these incredible people sitting to my left, your right. And that's Amanda Silver. Grew up in New York City and received her bachelor's in history from Yale University and MFA from the University of Southern California in screenwriting. And her grandfather, Sidney Buckman, was a founding member of the Writers Guild and wrote the Academy Award-nominated Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, among many others.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Rick Jaffa studied history and political science at SMU, earned his MBA also at USC, and then began his career as an agent. But Silver and Jaffa are best known as husband and wife and collaborators for the past 25 years on some of the biggest titles in Hollywood. So they successfully conceived and helped reboot the Planet of the Apes franchise. The third War for the Planet of the Apes just opened this past summer on July 14th. Box Office Mojo is listing 487 million US box office. In 2015, they co-wrote the blockbuster Jurassic World. Recently grossed, it has grossed more than 1.6 billion worldwide, highest grossing film of all time. And then recently, they have teamed up with the Oscar-winning director and writer James Cameron to co-write the much anticipated sequels to a little film called Avatar. These are currently in pre-production, and they are also working on the script for a live-action Disney version of the film Mulan, which is currently in pre-production.
We haven't seen any of that money, by the way.
Sam Brown oversees production and development as the head of production for STX Films. He started his career as a development executive with New Line in 2002 and was most recently senior vice president of production. While at New Line, he executive produced the Dwayne Johnson and Kevin Hart comedy Central Intelligence, Key and Peele's Keanu, the latest installment of the Vacation franchise with Ed Helms and Christina Applegate, as well as the global box office San Andreas, also starring Dwayne Johnson. His other credits include the hit film Horrible Bosses and Horrible Bosses 2, the Adam Shankman musical Rock of Ages, the worldwide hit Journey to the Mysterious Island, the Harold and Kumar series, and the highly successful romantic comedies New Year's Eve and Valentine's Day.
Wow.
All right, so we are here on a panel called Writing for an International Audience. And you have all worked to create some of the films in recent years that have been the most popular in the United States, in China, and worldwide. And I think what is exciting for all of us here today is to talk about how those films from their earliest stages were made. And that means digging into the craft of storytelling. To really talk about how do we inspire audiences worldwide. And so I'd like to start with a very general question. What do you think accounts for the international popularity of some of these titles that I've listed?
Well, I think that in some cases, having an existing IP gives you a leg up. Obviously, you know, there's a built-in interest and want to see, and titles like Planet of the Apes and Jurassic, and so there's a built-in interest in saying, well, what are they going to do with this story? What's going to be new, and so forth. But ultimately, I don't, you know, that's just a small part of it.
Yeah, I would say on the studio side, it often gets reduced down to, is there a universal visual component? That tends to be a tool that you can sort of lean on that has a better chance of working in various territories around the world, including China, that doesn't rely on specific local language idioms or political situations. And there is something just fun and universal about seeing a huge dinosaur run rampant in a dinosaur amusement park, that you don't need to speak any language to understand the visual spectacle and fun that can create.
And then along with that, it's always great to have characters that bring something essentially human to the party, so that people in any culture and any country can relate to them and what they're going through.
Yeah, and there are elements of the human condition that run across all languages, cultures, ethnicities, countries. And if those, as Amanda said, if those characters that you're presenting are going through universally relatable and sort of human truths that everyone can relate, love, loss, tragedy, laughter, thrills, fear, like that tends to allow for those characters in those movies to work in a more effective way around the world.
Yeah, I can give one example, though. It's when we did the first draft of the first Apes movie, we got to the second act and realized that we were about to embark on maybe 40, 50 pages where there wasn't any dialogue, which was a challenge to us as writers. We were excited about the challenge, but in terms of what Sam was saying, you know, you're basically watching a film play out with no need for dialogue.
Yeah.
And in terms of Caesar's character, you know, that whole idea really stemmed from an idea about that character. And we really wanted to create a character that anyone, anywhere on the planet who'd ever, you know, known a teenager, been a teenager, was going to be a teenager, anyone that felt alienated at that point, which Caesar basically was a teenager when he's thrown into the facility, that, you know, everyone could relate to. And it was visual.
Mm-hmm.
Another piece to it, also on top of all those things, is that I think an audience can smell it on the movie if you're just making the movie to make money. Mm-hmm. So if there's some sort
We hope they can't smell it, by the way. Just to be clear.
But if there's some sort of premise or theme connected to the movie that, you know, for example, in Jurassic World, it would be that commercialism and greed destroys itself. you could say that's the theme of the movie. And even though you're not preaching to the audience, that's never a good idea. They know that there's a reason to tell this story.
Yeah, and that brings
Beyond-
up. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go
Keep
ahead,
going.
go ahead.
Well, that brings up another really important component that we think about and discuss a lot on the studio side, which is when you're trying to build a piece of content that has and you're trying to give that piece of content, a movie, a story, the greatest probability or potential to work, not just in North America, but around the world, you can find yourself in this myopic trap of thinking, well, it needs to work in every territory. So let's get an element that can resonate in China. Let's get an element that can resonate in India, an element that resonate in South America. And suddenly you look up and you Frankenstein this story, this project together that has no resonance for any of those territories because it doesn't feel authentic. It wasn't birthed in an authentic way. And that's the real challenge for us, is how do we build something that can work for a global audience, but that feels organic and authentic. It doesn't feel like you've just sort of patched something together.
Yeah, it's a tail wagging the dog.
Yeah, exactly.
So on that note, we often say in writing, specificity is strength. And so how do you balance trying to be very specific, maybe to a setting or culture or certain character, but also opening it up so that it is accessible?
I would argue that the strength is always in the specificity and the relatability. You may have to educate the audience about a certain culture. For example, you take a movie like The Godfather. Well, in that opening wedding, he teaches you everything you need to know about what it is to be an Italian, part of one of those families at that time. But the specificity of the characters and the setting grounds the drama. It makes it gives it that authenticity that Sam was describing, that feeling of it being organic. If you're not grounded by the detail, it feels false. It feels general and vague.
Yeah, and The Godfather is a good example. That was a very specific portrait of a Italian-American family that obviously had that was in the sort of organized crime, but the themes that movie was exploring were very universal. And so it was universal themes explored through and sort of presented through the lens of characters that were painted in a very specific way. And again, I can't relate to being an Italian-American gangster, but I can relate to some of the themes that the characters are going through.
Well, family.
Yeah.
It's a family story, and all families have their issues. There's no such thing as a functional family, I don't think. But yeah, so with that particular example, you're talking about a group of people that were really doing horrible things, but you liked them because of the specificity of the family code and their relationships to one another and the loyalty between them. Mm-hmm. But we do an enormous amount of research on our scripts. And with Mulan, we spent, months and months reading about Chinese history, the Tang Dynasty, about cultural things, filial piety, and so. And then on Avatar, I have to tell you guys, Jim is just he's the real deal when it comes to doing his homework. And he can tell you how many rivets are in those space shuttles that come down and explain literally. No, seriously. He'll tell you about the plant life and the gravitational pull of Pandora versus, some other planet. And it's just stuff that and when we went to work with him, it was stuff he really wanted us to know. And so what was weird is we slowly started to feel like maybe that was the reality and that our world was not real, But you need to know all those things, and then.
And then when you go into the movie, when you watch his movies, you're 100% invested that the characters feel
in the
real.
characters and the story, yeah.
Yeah,
The story is real. You go on this journey with them, and you're there 100%.
If you don't do the research, though, it's like then, and you don't get to know the world, then you find you're writing stuff that you've just seen in another movie or on television. Mm-hmm. and that's when it really gets dicey.
Yeah, I'm not sure an audience could recognize and articulate why they respond to certain
Right.
characters in certain movies, but I would argue that a huge component of an audience's engagement in a character and in a movie is related to the amount of homework that the writer, filmmakers, and everyone involved in the production has put into every single element of that production. If every character is presented, and you may not even know this, but there's 100 pages written about that character that don't even come through on screen, it does come through in sort of the actor's performance and the way the filmmaker's presenting it.
Yeah.
Jim, knowing the number of rivets on the space shuttle in Avatar, it may sound ridiculous, but that is tends to be an indicator of how satisfying that piece of that movie is going to be.
Yeah.
Right, it's not a conscious thing from the audience. Like, these are facts the audience will never know.
But you can sense
it's-
that
it's
hollowness.
in
You
it.
can sense that inauthenticity. You can sense the sort of the fabricated nature of it versus something that feels realer and deeper.
Right, when you watch something and it's got that patina of depth and reality to it, that's part of
Yeah.
why that's happened.
So what is your process? It sounds like you dig really deep and surround yourself with all of this research, but then how do you kind of, especially with a very large property that you're kind of steps down in the process in, how do you find the heart, and where do you ground yourself story-wise?
Well, it's always the character's journey, the singular character or the group of characters. And, it takes some hard work and sometimes leaps of faith, because you don't go in usually and the character and the world are already alive. You have to kind of blow life into them. You've got to pray that happens. You've got to show up and do your research and spend time with these characters. And sooner or later, if you're lucky, they come alive and then they have a journey that's that you're going to go on this journey with them. And sometimes, I know this sounds crazy and obvious at the same time, but the story doesn't exist beforehand. Like, as a screenwriter, sometimes you're looking at something and you don't know what it is, but you know something has to happen on page 40. You're not sure what it is, and so you're searching for it. It's as if it already exists and you're discovering it. Does that sound crazy?
Yeah. Amanda talked about this earlier, though. So in terms of the process, the very first thing we always ask is, well, why are we making this movie? What's the point of telling this story or retelling it in some cases, now? And what can we say? And is it valid? And is it worth the effort? And once we've got that, then we start talking about the characters. But then, why does this character need this journey right now? Why now? Why is this day different than the other day? So we spend a lot of time on that, and then you get those two things to marry one another. Mm-hmm. But that's really the beginning. And then in terms of existing properties, it's tough because you're talking about properties that people love, much beloved, like Jurassic and Planet of the Apes, for example. Well, and Avatar too, and Mulan. People bring a lot to that, and so you have to offer the audiences something new and something different, but you also have to deliver on the stuff that they love about those pre-existing titles.
Both at the same time.
At the same time, and that's kind of a hard thing to walk. With Apes, we decided early on we weren't going to have any time travel. We were just going to tell it straight ahead, and we weren't going to try to compete with Rod Serling's image of the Statue of Liberty on the beach. We just weren't going to try to compete because we didn't think we could, But it wasn't important to the story that we were telling at the time. So, and that was tough because we were worried that people would say, "Wait a minute, what? There's no big twist," or "Wait a minute, there's no time travel." But that was a choice that we made. But we really tried to honor the fan base and the original piece of material as best we could.
Yeah, you guys have your hands full because if you're thinking about sequels, remakes, reboots, it's a double-edged sword. There's an advantage because there's an awareness, a general awareness, or there's a presumed awareness of the title and the sort of the basic story. But then there's that added challenge of having to overcome the baggage of expectations that an audience will bring to that movie.
Right.
We talk about it a lot with sequels, which is, by definition, if you're contemplating a sequel to a movie, the first movie achieved some level of success. And if it achieved some level of success, it also made an imprint on an audience. And if it made an imprint on an audience, part of that imprint was born out of novelty, discovery, newness. And the sequel, by definition, is robbed of those elements. There's no more novelty, there's no more newness, there's no more discovery. And it's a real challenge for the writers and filmmakers to find new things to sort of put into that sequel, remake, reboot, to make it feel fresh and new again, because as much as it's an advantage to have a piece of IP or a movie that worked, sort of create some wind at your back going into the market, there's still, expectations are different, and I would argue higher for the audience going into that movie.
So then, Sam, what's your process? You working with writers like Rick and Amanda? Where, like, what's your back and forth, and how do you kind of shepherd the film?
Steady.
Well, first thing I would say is
Steady.
there is. I'm not a writer. I've never been a writer, but the notion of staring at a blank computer screen or typewriter page is, I imagine, and know enough to know that it is incredibly daunting. To create is different than to critique. And what we do is we critique. And yes, we can identify sort of notions of, we think the world wants something like this. Let's go find some people to help write that for us. But for the most part, they're creating and we're reacting. There is a sort of adage that I and a lot of my colleagues live by, which is, our job is not to be the funniest, smartest person in the room. Our job is to identify and hire people that are smart, funny, creative, clever, and empower them and give them the resources they need. And I try to remind myself of that every day, every time I give writers a set of notes. And the other thing I and my company, the way we approach filmmakers and writers, as a rule, is, here are our thoughts. Let's have a conversation about why we're feeling the way we feel, and it's up to you to decide how much of that you want to incorporate and how much you don't want to incorporate. And we will flag the stuff that feels more important to us, and we'll flag the stuff that feels less important. And we just want to have a conversation, because usually, and you guys can speak to this better than I can, if someone isn't feeling something, the way that they articulate what they feel is missing may not be the right answer, but the feeling behind that, there may be something there and it's worth exploring. And it is, again, I tend to prefer to keep it conversational. And we'll also oftentimes start a conversation, well, what was your intent with that character, this scene, this act, this movie? And did that intent resonate or come through to me, and me as sort of trying to represent a general audience? And sometimes it's just as simple as, oh, that's what you wanted to do. Well, it didn't quite connect for me. And yeah, if you just change this, this, and this, maybe it would. And they go off and change it, and it suddenly does. Oftentimes it's as simple as that, which is not a good or bad, or this works or this didn't work. It was just trying to sort of help the writers, the filmmakers, present their work in the way that they intended it to be presented.
Hey, we should work with him.
Yeah, no, this is all, yeah, this is me on my best day.
It's so true, though. If we've ever gotten a note that we know is off, we also know that it's coming from someplace. Yeah. So maybe the suggestion that we're being given might be wrong, or we know that's not going to work. But it's very instructive to learn that something hasn't landed, or something you think is on the page, a moment isn't there.
Yeah. And you often hear the note behind the note, and that's sort of the right. Distillation of that.
We were really lucky. Our first movie was with Curtis Hanson, a terrific director and great guy, and he taught us that no matter how silly a note might sound, it is coming from something. And again, it's like, well, what was the intent? And well, if our intent on this page was to show this about a specific character or take the story in a surprising direction, then that's their note might be on a certain page, but what they're really talking about is this other thing.
And what I have found, and there are, I'm sure, books of stories of these, which is some studio head will come in and say, well, I want that bus green instead of red. And sometimes it's just whimsical. Sometimes it's not based in any sort of, there's no justification for it. That, I think, can be challenging for filmmakers and writers. But for the most part, if someone comes in and say, hey, I want that bus to be red, not green, and here's why, because there's a green background and the bus will get lost and we can't see it, and that's important for our trailer because we need the bus to convey some special thing in the trailer, and if it doesn't work in the trailer, then we're not as confident in our ability to sell the movie. That, I imagine, that note would be met with much more sort of a much more constructive reaction than just simply coming in and mandating, I want that bus red or green.
Yeah.
So how does also for Sam, how does the international structure of STX as a business affect what you guys try to champion?
So we have, as an organization, a number of strategic investors, a number of slate partners that represent a lot of the biggest markets around the world, most notably China. We've never felt, at least I've never felt, a sort of a creative, influential force from beyond pushing me in certain directions. Hey, don't cast this person, cast this person. Don't tell this story, tell this story. I don't feel that on a daily basis. However, and it frustrates me that the local trade, the trades, everything tends to sort of be represented, and it's getting better, presented to the world in the form of domestic North America box office as sort of this leading indicator of whether a movie is a financial hit or not. And that's like saying, if the movie worked in Texas, is it a hit or not? Like, there is a whole world of ticket buyers out there. So you have to look at any given movie not as something that can or can't work in North America. Sure, that's a big component of it. North America is still the biggest market. But can this movie work for a global audience? And that is something that we think about and talk about and actually try to quantify on every single project that we're going into. And if there is a piece of material that just feels like it's going to be really challenged outside North America, well, it doesn't mean you can't make it. It just means you have to make it for a price that justifies its existence, just limited to the North American marketplace or the English-speaking territories. And if you have a movie that feels like it could absolutely resonate for a global audience, well, then that creates some relief on the budget threshold because it just has much more potential. So we think about things in global terms, and we have a lot of global strategic and financial partners in our organization, I think is just simply an acknowledgement that these movies that we're making here in Los Angeles are really consumed around the world, and it would be imprudent to not acknowledge that and try to build movies for that audience.
So coming back to writing, does that, when you're looking at a script, what is it that you're looking for that maybe indicates an international sensibility or success? It's hard to answer, and what I would say is that's not the first thing we think about. The first thing we think about is this a good story that's worth telling and is told well? Well, maybe those are related.
Yeah, and that is sort of, once you sort of can connect to that, and once you can say, wow, I was moved by this script, I was engaged in this story, I love this character, I love this world, I love all these things, then you do the secondary and tertiary analysis of, is this something by its very nature that will only resonate in certain select markets, North America, or only in Russia, or only in certainly, or does it have the components that we talked about before that at least allow it to have a chance of working in the international marketplace? And again, a lot of it just comes back to relatable themes, which are not as hard to come by as one would think, and just making sure that you're not stepping on any third rails for any of the biggest markets. And I think we don't have to get into that, but and those tend to be easily adjusted. If you have a horrible villain in your movie, and that horrible villain is Russian, and it's just a despicable character, well, that might make it a little bit harder for that movie to work in Russia because you're portraying Russian, if that's the only portrayal of Russian in the movie, as a villainous character, and if that's an important marker for you, and if that's sort of how that project will probably be received there, you might want to adjust it to a generic villain, however you want to define it. But there are certain things you can go back into the script and the movie and say, oh, gee, that one little moment or that one character or the one representation suddenly makes it hard for this big swath of audience. Maybe we should adjust that.
So back to Rick and Amanda, when you are working on these kind of larger properties that you're trying to move with cross borders, what do you feel like is the most important emotion you're really trying to get your audience to feel?
Something.
Yeah. You have to feel something.
Yeah.
So well, the funny thing is what we work a lot with is really two emotions that go hand in hand, which are hope and fear. Mm-hmm. And it's really simple. If we go into a sequence, you hope you want the audience to hope one thing happens, and yet fear that one thing is never going to happen.
In other words, they have rooting interest on every single page.
Every page.
I mean, every part of every page. Mm-hmm. Like when we write a script that's working, we know at every moment, you could just like flip the script open and point to random places. We know what we're trying to get the audience to feel. They're really worried. They're hoping he gets there in time, or they're worried that she's going to find out, or what you're doing is you're engaging the audience, so that if the filmmaker had the I was trying to do that example, so that the whole audience would be like leaning this way if they couldn't see down. If the filmmaker Rosemary's Baby,
Rosemary's Baby. There's a very famous story where they set up the shot. It was the shot is someone sitting on a bed and the camera's on the other side of a doorway. Yeah. So it's through a doorway. Ruth Gordon, and the shot was set up, and Roman Polanski, who directed it, came in and saw her. And the way it was framed was that she was sitting perfectly in the frame. It's a beautiful shot, perfectly in frame, and in the middle of this doorway. And he said, no. You put the camera over here so that you can't really see her.
They only see part of her.
And the DP was like, no, you won't be able to see her. He said, no, trust me, this is the best way to do it. And so in the first test screening, when it came to that shot, they noted they were in the back of the theater. Everybody was doing this to try to see around that door. And so, so we use that example.
The point is, though, whatever the audience is feeling, they're feeling something because they're engaged. And I believe people go to the movies or they watch TV or whatever, whether they're conscious of this or not, for catharsis. They want a good cry, or they want a good scare, or they want to kind of work through the feelings they're having without it being about them, the fictional character. So even if it's a comedy, whether it's a comedy or a tragedy, the point is that you keep them feeling something.
Yeah. Yeah. And the producers, you hope they'll succeed, and yet they won't. So that's those, and then like the bigger thoughts of love or hate or whatever really are just stem from that.
Is that ever culturally specific, or is it? An example of this might be Mulan. Mm-hmm. Are you leaning into, and this will be the last one because I'm sorry, we need to go to Q&A. But are you leaning into one specific something that you want something to feel that might be more specific to a culture?
It's so interesting because with Mulan, I don't know if people know this, but she's an iconic figure in China. Mm-hmm. She's a 7th century ballad was about Mulan, and even today, school children are taught the Ballad of Mulan in school. So it's very important for them culturally. We had done a lot of research, and then when we handed the script in, we had advisors. Disney has been very much into figuring out culturally, and there was a lot we had to learn about the way that the Chinese think about family and family obligation versus the way Americans, for example, think about that. So our job was to make those themes resonate with everybody, no matter what culture you're in. But you have to understand it first and then educate about what the situation Mulan specifically is in her family. What's her motivation to go on the journey she goes on.
Yeah, you can't, we're not relying on what would be a classically Western journey because she's not Western.
She's not going on this journey for herself.
All right, I think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience.
They're all going to be about Avatar.
Right here in the front.
I actually would love to ask about Avatar, but I'm not going to do it. Really happy to have all you guys here. This has been really interesting. I just wanted to ask, specifically with Rick and Amanda, I'm almost done at USC in the film school, and I wanted to ask you guys about those sort of post-college years, about sort of navigating your way into where you are as writers now.
Well, I have my story. I got really lucky coming out of USC because I sold my script. But I think what I would say is if you're a writer, are you
in the
writer?
writing program?
Writing and directing.
Have you made a film, or are you writing a script, or? Okay. Well, go ahead. You want to? And by the way,
I have a whole spiel.
you're probably much better. I mean,
Yeah,
So people come to me all the time. Like, people come to me all the time. And I'm not a writer, but sometimes I'm the only person they know in the industry and say, hey, I'm an aspiring writer. I'll talk about that. If an aspiring actor, aspiring director, the guidance is a little bit different. But for writing, what I tend to say is, and you guys can sort of back me up because you're actual writers, is you won't know if you have both the talent, but almost more importantly, and I guess sort of people are blind to it, the constitution to be a working writer until you've written your 10th discrete screenplay. So the sooner you can get through to your 10th, the sooner you'll know, am I good enough, and do I like it? And that's also a way to get away from a trap that a lot of people that I've sort of encountered can fall into who are aspiring writers, which is they'll labor through one screenplay and then just keep tweaking and tweaking and tweaking the screenplay for years, and they're never actually, I mean, maybe these guys were the few people on the earth that were touched by God and just were, the first time they put pen to paper, it was genius. That's not the case. You got to do your 10,000 hours. It's a learned thing. You can't just sort of jump in it. It looks easy. It looks sexy. It looks romantic. It is not. So the only way to sort of get there is just to do the work and get 10 going, and don't fall in the trap of reworking one on and on.
Yeah, that's really
That's
good
such a
advice.
good spiel. I like that.
Because
So true.
even if we were very, very fortunate, and were able to sell our first screenplays and so forth. However, I will say that the toughness and constitution that Sam's talking about is really vital because, we were really lucky. We were young. We got married. We were sold scripts. We got a movie made. It's like, oh my God, this is the most incredible romantic fantasy of all time. And then you have a kid, and then you have another kid, and then, and then suddenly, you got 3 movies that looked like they were going to go, but then they didn't go for reasons that had nothing to do with the script. And before you know it, your agent's not calling you back. And, and we've been there. And so you gotta, you really do have to be dedicated and know what you're getting into. And it's tough, Yeah,
I would also say, and I don't know if this was your experience, especially when you're at the early stages, you're so fixated on getting there and having one transaction, having someone option your script or buy your script, which is a huge, rare, special achievement. Number 2 is only a little bit easier. It's not like once you get there, you're like,
Right.
They welcome you into the special club and they set you up for life. That is not the case. It's a continued labor, and it's often that is labor.
Yeah, and this 10,000 hour thing, I really believe in it because, we've been at this for almost 30 years. And sometimes we look at each other and realize we're just now learning things. We're just now starting to figure out things that I feel extremely confident in no matter what we tackle next. I know the level of quality that we're going to bring to it. It may not get made, but I know the level of quality that we can control But I tell you, it's taken a lot of, you know what? We pay attention, you know, like really pay attention. You go to the movies or watch the television show, it's like, well, what is it about this that's moving me? Or what is it about this that's not moving me? And
Also, what Sam said is really important, that you've got to love the writing. You've got to love it, because it's hard. It's a hard business. So
Read
that's gotta
and
be
watch.
your-
yeah, exactly. Read a lot. Get a lot of eyeballs on your material. People you trust, you know, that'll be honest with you. And 'cause a lot of people will, that's hard to do. That's hard to find the right people. But as many people as you can get to read your stuff, that's the other thing.
I'm being told we actually have to wrap up, but if you guys wouldn't mind maybe taking one or two by the side of the stage, but I know they both have to run. And so let me just say a huge thank you to the Writers Guild Foundation, to Screencraft, to all of you for joining us to celebrate this process of international storytelling and learning what we can, but really a big thank you to the people sitting next to me. So let's give them a round of applause.
And thank you to Emily.
Thank you very
thank
much.
you, Emily.
Very happy
Thank
to
you
be
all.
here.